Practice set 1.3, the first one. Write the following statements in if-then form. The first one, the opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent. We have to write this in if-then form. So how we will write the opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent? So if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then opposite angles of that quadrilateral are congruent. If a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then opposite angles of that quadrilateral are congruent. Next, the diagonals of a rectangle are congruent. Now, it is given the diagonals of a rectangle are congruent. How we will write in if-then form? If the quadrilateral is a rectangle, then the diagonals are congruent. If quadrilateral is, what is a quadrilateral? It is a rectangle. If the diagonals of a rectangle are congruent, if quadrilateral is a rectangle, then diagonals are congruent. Then diagonals are congruent. Next, in an isosceles triangle, the segment joining the vertex and the midpoint of the base, joining the vertex and the midpoint of the base is perpendicular to the base. So how do we write it in if-then form? If the triangle is an isosceles triangle, then the segment joining the vertex of a triangle and the midpoint of the base is perpendicular to the base. So we start if the triangle is an isosceles triangle, then segment joining vertex of a triangle and midpoint of the base is perpendicular to the base. Second one, write the converse of the following statements. The alternate angles formed by two parallel lines and their transversal are congruent. Here we have to write the converse of this. So how we write the converse of this? If alternate angles made by two lines and its transversal are congruent, then the lines are parallel. So we write if alternate angles made by what? Made by two lines and its transversal transversal are congruent, then the lines are parallel. Then the lines are parallel. The next one, if a pair of interior angles made by a transversal of two lines are supplementary, then the lines are parallel. So how we write? If two parallel lines are intersected, by a transversal, the interior angles so formed are supplementary. If two parallel lines are intersected by a transversal, then what will happen? If two parallel lines are intersected by a transversal, the interior angles so formed are supplementary. The interior angles so formed are supplementary. Next one, the diagonals of a rectangle are congruent. What does it say? That the diagonals are given to us and they are saying of the rectangle are congruent. Now we have to write the converse of this. We'll start what is, if the diagonals of a quadrilateral are congruent, then that quadrilateral is a rectangle. Carefully see, if the diagonals of a quadrilateral are congruent, then that quadrilateral is a rectangle. If the diagonals of a quadrilateral, what if the diagonals of a quadrilateral are congruent? If the diagonals of a quadrilateral are congruent, then that quadrilateral is a rectangle. Then that quadrilateral is a rectangle.